Good evening, my dear friends, and welcome to our fireside gathering. Outside, snow drifts gently past the bookshop windows, while within, the kettle hums and the armchair by the fire waits for you. Tonight's tale is the Deadly Mincemeat Feast, a Miss Marple Mystery, where a dish meant for celebration conceals a darker secret. Amid the laughter of a winter supper, a single taste proves fatal, and only the quiet eyes of Miss Marple notice what others overlook. Tell me, where are you listening from this evening? I do love knowing where our little community has settled in. And I wonder, can you piece together the truth before Miss Marple does? Chapter 1 Whispers Beneath the Holly. Morning light spilled gently across the village of St. Mildred's, turning the snow into a sheet of pale gold. The church bells, muffled by frost, rang out their familiar chime, but there was something unusual in the air that morning, an undercurrent of agitation, as though the very hedgerows had heard the dreadful news. By the time the baker opened his shutters, the entire village seemed to hum with whispers of what had happened at the vicarage the night before. Mrs. Weatherby was the first to voice it openly, bustling into the grocer's with her shawl clutched tightly about her shoulders. "Dead at the table, imagine it," she exclaimed, her words carrying as she leaned over the counter. "One moment enjoying his mince pie, and the next gone. Doctor says it was his heart, but I never believe in hearts that suddenly give out, do you?" Behind her, Miss Cartwright, the milliner, gasped with relish. They say his face went quite gray, fell forward onto the pudding. Positively dreadful. Poor Reverend, having such a tragedy at his Christmas table. She lowered her voice, though not so much as to keep from being overheard. "And some are whispering poison." The words seemed to hang in the air, sharp and dangerous, like a frost-tipped holly leaf. At the post office, where the brass bell jangled merrily with each new arrival, tongues wagged with equal enthusiasm. Mrs. Blake, sorting letters with a hand that trembled from excitement rather than age, declared that she had always suspected Mr. Pennington would meet a dramatic end. "Too much temper in a man rarely leads to peace in his final days," she told a small crowd gathered by the coal stove. "Why, only last week I heard him quarreling with Mr. Harwood about the church funds." "But quarreling isn't killing," interrupted old Mr. Price, who came in daily for his newspaper. "And Pennington was a magistrate once, don't forget. He made plenty of enemies. If you ask me, it's an old grudge come to roost." The crowd murmured in agreement, though each clung secretly to a different version of events, polishing it like a prized trinket before passing it along. Some swore the pie had been tainted. Others insisted it was the mulled wine. A few even whispered that someone had tampered with the holly sprig on the table, though no one could explain how a berry might bring a man down. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat unobtrusively at her window in the high street, teacup in hand, watching the patterns of human behavior unfold. She knew well how swiftly gossip could twist itself into knots of suspicion, how fear exaggerated the smallest of details. Already the village was dividing into camps, those who pitted Pennington and those who, in truth, considered his passing a kind of rough justice. Yet Miss Marple's eyes softened. Human beings were rarely so simple. Beneath their chatter, their judgments, their eagerness for a story, there often lay deep currents of jealousy, resentment, or grief. And in such currents, darker motives might be concealed. By noon, the news had flown from cottage to cottage like a restless sparrow, and scarcely a hearth in St. Mildred's remained untouched by speculation. The feast that should have been remembered for warmth and fellowship had become, in a single night, the talk of the county, a tale of sudden death beneath the holly. And somewhere, Miss Marple thought quietly, someone knew precisely why. By the following evening, the village of St. Mildred's was shrouded in more than snow. It was wrapped in unease. Candles flickered in cottage windows, curtains were drawn tight, and families sat closer to their firesides, speaking in low voices as if fearful that even the walls might overhear. For what had begun as idle gossip was fast turning into a chilling suspicion that Mr. Pennington had not died naturally, but by poison. At the Red Hart Inn, the usual laughter was subdued. Villagers nursed their tankards and leaned closer across polished oak tables. Mrs. Longford, a widow with a flair for the dramatic, set her glass down with a thud. Mark my words, he was poisoned. One doesn't simply keel over in the middle of supper, not with the doctor sitting only 3 chairs away. But Dr. Partridge said it was his heart, murmured the innkeeper, uneasy at the way her words prickled the room. Mrs. Longford sniffed. Doctors see what they expect to see. I've always said, a good dose of arsenic can fool even the cleverest. She lowered her voice to a near whisper. And wasn't he the only one to eat that second helping of mince pie? The remark sent a ripple through the room, each listener recalling how Pennington, with a smug smile, had claimed the largest slice for himself. Across the lane, at the vicarage itself, the Reverend and his wife found their telephone ringing with a frequency most unholy. Friends, parishioners, and distant relatives called to inquire with affected sympathy. Though always, beneath their condolences, the same hushed question emerged. Was it true he'd been poisoned? Mrs. Winthrop, flustered and weary, insisted that nothing of the kind had been proven, though she could not deny the unease in her own heart. Children were sent to bed early, though they overheard enough to carry wild tales to school the next morning. Some claimed the mince pies had been cursed. Others whispered that the holly berries on the table were deadly. The teacher, Miss Simmons, tried in vain to hush them, though even she glanced nervously at her lunch, pushing the plum pudding aside. Fear, once seated, grows quickly. Housewives eyed their spice jars suspiciously, as though cinnamon might conceal something sinister. At the butcher's, customers asked pointed questions about cleanliness and storage, while the grocer found his dried fruits suddenly suspect. In a village accustomed to comfort and trust, mistrust now crept like frost into every corner. Miss Marple, visiting the churchyard with her knitting bag discreetly tucked under one arm, overheard 2 elderly ladies at the gate. "Terrible thing, to poison a man at Christmas," said one, shivering in her coat. The other pursed her lips. "Well, terrible perhaps, but no surprise." Pennington had a sharp tongue. "You reap what you sow." Miss Marple paused, fingers resting lightly on her scarf. Such remarks, she knew, revealed more than they intended. To dismiss a death so readily suggested not merely gossip, but deep-seated resentment. And resentment was fertile soil for darker deeds. By dusk, St. Mildred's no longer felt like the same village. Doors were locked earlier, shutters drawn against the night. Every creak of the wind seemed to echo the whispered word that now defined the tragedy: poison. And though the snow still lay soft and white upon the cottages, Miss Marple's sharp eyes discerned the truth behind the tranquil picture. The village's peace had been shattered, and its fears were only just beginning. Chapter 2: Clues in Candlelight. The vicarage drawing-room was filled with a subdued hush the following afternoon, as several of the feast's guests gathered once more. Outside, twilight painted the snow in shades of lavender and pearl, while inside, candles flickered in polished holders, casting tall shadows upon the walls. Though the fire burned cheerfully, a chill seemed to cling to the room, born not of the weather, but of the unspoken subject between them. Reverend Winthrop, grave-faced yet attempting courtesy, poured tea with a steadiness that belied his inner turmoil. "It is perhaps best," he began, "if we try to remember the details clearly. Dr. Partridge has advised me that every recollection may help. At this, a murmur swept around the circle. Details. Yes, it was details that mattered now. The pies, the glasses, the seating arrangements, each one suddenly significant in light of tragedy. Mrs. Weatherby, whose memory for small things was notorious, leaned forward eagerly. Mr. Pennington was seated at the center of the long table, just beneath the sprig of holly, wasn't he? He insisted upon it, said he had the right place, being the guest of honor. She smoothed her skirts with a flutter of satisfaction at recalling so important a point. Yes, yes, added Mr. Harwood, adjusting his spectacles. And I sat 2 places down, near the pudding. I distinctly remember Pennington reaching across for the mustard just before the main course. His brow furrowed, though I can't imagine mustard having anything to do with it. A nervous laugh followed, quickly hushed. Miss Cartwright spoke next, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. He had 2 glasses before him, one for wine, one for water, but he scarcely touched the wine. I remember because he teased me about refilling mine too often. Her cheeks flushed faintly at the recollection. So, it cannot have been the wine, surely? All eyes shifted uneasily, the flicker of suspicion darting from glass to plate, from memory to memory. Then the mince pies, suggested Mrs. Longford, never one to keep silent. There were 3 trays, 2 from the vicarage kitchen, and 1 Mrs. Blake brought specially. Pennington chose from Mrs. Blake's tray, did he not? Mrs. Blake, affronted, stiffened in her chair. Indeed he did, but so did half the table. If my pies were at fault, I should think others would be in their graves by now. Miss Marple, sitting unobtrusively near the hearth, let the dispute play itself out while her knitting needles clicked softly. It was remarkable, she reflected, how swiftly people began to assign guilt when fear hovered in the air. Each villager remembered the scene through a slightly different lens, their observations colored by rivalries, pride, or resentment. Yet within their contradictions might lie the truth. She considered the arrangement carefully. Pennington at the center, his plate heaped high, his fork moving with self-assured greed. 2 glasses untouched by others. A second helping taken, though few followed suit. Was it choice or chance that brought the fatal portion to him? Dr. Partridge, standing by the mantel with furrowed brow, raised his hand for silence. Let us not leap to conclusions. I shall be requesting the coroner's opinion in due course. Still, if anyone recalls the precise moment of his collapse, the expressions, the gestures, it may aid us. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Each guest strained to recall, but their minds presented only fragments. A cough, a laugh, a hand reaching for the salt. Shadows lengthened as the candles guttered low, and it seemed to Miss Marple that the truth lay not in what was remembered, but in what had been conveniently forgotten. When the gathering at the vicarage broke apart, the villagers drifted homeward, their boots crunching over the snow, their voices lowered to anxious whispers. Yet Miss Marple lingered by the fire, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag. She had listened attentively, as was her way, not only to the words spoken, but also to the silences between them. And it was in those silences that she sensed the shape of something important. Later, as she walked home along the high street, she allowed her mind to sift through the recollections. They were, she reflected, curiously inconsistent. Mrs. Weatherby had placed Pennington directly beneath the sprig of holly, while Mr. Harwood was equally certain he sat beside the mustard. A small matter, perhaps, but in Miss Marple's experience, small matters often grew into larger truths. And then there was Miss Cartwright, insisting that Pennington scarcely touched his wine, though Mrs. Longford had implied the opposite, saying he grew red in the face after drinking. Could both be right? Or was one shading the truth, consciously or unconsciously. Human memory was a slippery thing, often molded by prejudice or desire. Miss Marple paused by the post office window, gazing at the frosted glass. Memory, she thought, is like patchwork. Each piece may be vivid, but the whole pattern can deceive. The next morning, she invited Mrs. Weatherby in for tea. It was a simple arrangement. Lace cloth spread upon the table, sponge cake cut neatly on a plate, but Miss Marple had long known the power of a friendly chat. "My dear," she said kindly, "I was thinking about the feast, and how dreadful it must have been. I can't seem to recall. Was Mr. Pennington seated to the left or the right of Mr. Harwood?" Mrs. Weatherby, delighted to be consulted, answered without hesitation. "To the right, of course. I remember perfectly, for I noticed the holly sprig above his head. It drooped quite badly." Later, Miss Marple put the same question to Mr. Harwood himself, who frowned and pushed his spectacles higher on his nose. "To my left," he said firmly. "He asked me to pass the mustard, and that was quite enough of an inconvenience, I assure you." Two confident answers, both irreconcilable. At the grocer's, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Blake defending her pies yet again. She insisted she had served them directly to the vicar, who then passed the tray to Pennington. Yet the vicar, when questioned discreetly, swore that he had been pouring wine at the time and had never touched the tray at all. To most, these contradictions would appear to be the natural muddle of shocked minds. But to Miss Marple, they rang like small bells of warning. People might forget details, yes, but they seldom invented them out of nothing. If two versions of an event existed, it meant someone's memory was shaped by more than mere confusion. That evening, in her sitting room lit by the steady glow of a single lamp, Miss Marple laid down her knitting and considered the matter. A pattern was forming, though faint as yet. Certain villagers remembered events in ways that conveniently distanced them from the food or drink. Others shifted Pennington's position at the table as though erasing proximity. It was not what they remembered that struck Miss Marple most, but what they chose to forget. And she could not help but wonder, was this forgetfulness born of fear or guilt? Chapter 3: The Wrong Guest. The first serious suspicion, as often happens in such cases, fell upon an outsider. In a village where every face was familiar, it was perhaps inevitable that attention should turn toward the one figure who did not quite belong. Elsie Pratt, the young maid on temporary loan from her cousin in Much Haddam. Elsie had arrived only a fortnight before the Christmas feast, a shy girl with downcast eyes and quick, nervous movements. She had been brought in to assist with the extra duties at the vicarage, her cousin swearing she was honest and hard-working. Yet now, in the wake of Mr. Pennington's death, tongues wagged with renewed vigor. "She was serving at the table, wasn't she?" declared Mrs. Longford at the Red Hart Inn, her voice carrying over the low murmur of conversation. "And close enough to slip something into his glass or his plate, if she had the mind. She brought in the tray of pies," added Miss Cartwright, who never forgot an opportunity to embellish a tale. "I saw her myself, hands shaking as she set them down. If that isn't guilt, I don't know what is." The idea spread quickly, like fire catching in dry straw. By the following morning, half the village had agreed. If Pennington had been poisoned, it was surely the maid. Poor Elsie bore the weight of suspicion with wide, frightened eyes. She lodged at the vicarage in a small attic room, and Mrs. Winthrop, though kind-hearted, could not hide her unease. Neighbors began to treat the girl as though her very presence were tainted. Shopkeepers watched closely as she paid for bread and tea, while children whispered cruel rhymes behind her back. Dr. Partridge, ever cautious, remarked that it was most improper to speculate without evidence, but his words carried little weight once the seed of suspicion had taken root. and Pennington, after all, had been a man of consequence. It seemed to some only fitting that blame fall on the lowest servant rather than one of their own. Miss Marple, however, observed the tide of gossip with thoughtful disapproval. She had seen such things before, how easily a stranger could be made scapegoat for the fears of a community. In her quiet way, she sought the girl out. She found Elsie in the vicarage kitchen, shoulders hunched, drying dishes with trembling hands. The fire in the grate gave little warmth, and the girl's face was pale. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you mustn't let their talk trouble you. People will say all manner of things when they are frightened." Elsie swallowed hard. "I never touched his food, miss. Not beyond what the Reverend told me. I swear it before God." Miss Marple's eyes, blue and kind, yet piercing, studied the girl. Fear she saw, and shame at being suspected, but not the sly evasiveness of guilt. "I believe you," she said softly, "and the truth, I think, will bear you out in time." But outside, the snow fell heavier, muffling the lanes, and whispers grew louder in its silence. To the village of St. Mildred's, the maid was guilty enough, if only because she was not one of them. And Miss Marple knew well that once suspicion rooted itself so firmly, it would take clear proof, and perhaps a little quiet cunning, to set matters right. The air in St. Mildred's grew heavy with suspicion. Every whispered conversation seemed to circle back to Elsie Pratt, the unfortunate maid. By the third day after the feast, many spoke of her guilt as though it were a certainty rather than conjecture. Yet Miss Marple, in her unobtrusive fashion, began to collect the threads of truth, certain that gossip had overlooked something important. It was in the grocer's shop that the first thread appeared. Elsie had entered timidly, head bowed, to purchase flour and sugar for the vicarage kitchen. Behind her, Mrs. Weatherby and Miss Cartwright exchanged pointed looks. "I wonder if she's buying more poison," Mrs. Weatherby muttered, loud enough for half the shop to hear. The girl's hand shook as she placed her coins on the counter. "I never touched Mr. Pennington's plate," she blurted suddenly, as if unable to bear the weight of silence. "I wasn't even in the room when he had that pie." The grocer frowned. "Not in the room? But everyone says." Elsie bit her lip, eyes darting toward the door. "I was in the scullery fetching more plates. Ask Mrs. Winthrop, she'll tell you. I didn't come back until after." Miss Marple, who happened to be examining a tin of tea nearby, tucked this remark quietly away. That afternoon, she walked up to the vicarage, her small boots crunching over the snow. Mrs. Winthrop received her kindly, though her eyes were shadowed with worry. When Miss Marple inquired gently about Elsie's whereabouts during the feast, the vicar's wife nodded at once. "Yes, she is quite right. I sent her to the scullery just before dessert. Poor child. She was there nearly 10 minutes, washing extra spoons. She could hardly have slipped poison into Pennington's plate when she was nowhere near it." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "And no one else has mentioned this?" Mrs. Winthrop sighed. "The villagers are quick to judge. It is easier, I suppose, to believe a servant capable of wickedness than to think of it among one's friends." The truth, then, was simple. Elsie could not have poisoned Pennington. The very moment he had lifted his fork, she was up to her elbows in soap suds, far from the dining room. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in her own parlor, turning the matter over as the lamplight glowed against her knitting. Fear had chosen Elsie as its target, but the facts now pointed elsewhere. If not the maid, then who? The answer, she suspected, lay among those seated comfortably at the table, the very people who so eagerly shifted suspicion onto another. Mr. Harwood with his sharp grievances, Mrs. Longford with her quick tongue, or perhaps even Mrs. Blake, whose pies had been so pointedly mentioned. Each recollection was riddled with contradictions, each memory serving its owner's convenience. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, steady as her thoughts. In her long life, she had learned that evil often wore the most respectable face, and that those quickest to accuse were frequently the most anxious to hide their own secrets. By the week's end, the village's certainty about Elsie began to waver. Whispers still clung to her name, but a new unease stirred. If the maid had an alibi, then suspicion must shift again. And in the candlelit shadows of St. Mildred's, one thing became very clear. The true culprit was still among them, unsuspected, biding their time. Chapter 4. Tidings of Secrets. In the days following Mr. Pennington's untimely death, the village of St. Mildred's settled into a strange rhythm of mourning and gossip. The church bell tolled each evening, and wreaths of evergreen were laid upon the Pennington gate. Yet beneath the solemn rituals, tongues wagged with renewed vigor. For if not the maid, then who? And in the asking, old quarrels and rivalries crept into the light once more. Mr. Pennington, as Miss Marple quietly reminded herself, had never been universally adored. He was a man of imposing manner and sharp tongue, with a knack for exposing the weaknesses of others. For years, he had presided over the parish council with something close to tyranny. His arguments with Mr. Harwood, the retired solicitor, were legendary. Harwood claimed Pennington had thwarted him in a land dispute that cost him dearly. The man was a bully, Harwood declared in the post office queue, his voice carrying. He delighted in making others small. Nor had Pennington's relations with Mrs. Longford been cordial. Their quarrel, though more private, had been no less bitter. Years ago, Pennington had accused her late husband of mismanaging parish funds. Though nothing was ever proven, the stain had remained. To hear Mrs. Longford tell it, Pennington had ruined her good name and left her little more than an object of pity. Even Mrs. Blake, whose pies had been so lauded at the feast, was not immune to his barbs. Only last summer, Pennington had accused her of overcharging at the bakery, suggesting in front of half the village that she weighed her loaves light. "Imagine such a thing, me of all people," Mrs. Blake exclaimed to Miss Marple, cheeks flushed with indignation. "He embarrassed me dreadfully. I could never forgive him for that." And then there was Lady Frobisher, the squire's widow. Though dignified and gracious in public, she had once been overheard lamenting Pennington's insufferable arrogance. It was whispered that he had sought to block her late husband's memorial plaque in the church, arguing it was an unnecessary indulgence. To cross Lady Frobisher in such a fashion was to make an enemy indeed. Miss Marple listened to all these grievances with her usual mild attentiveness. She never pressed too hard, but her quiet presence seemed to loosen tongues. People were eager to be heard, eager to unburden themselves of the resentments they had carried for years. And, as Miss Marple well knew, resentment was fertile soil for darker deeds. One evening, as she sat with Reverend Winthrop over a pot of steaming tea, he sighed heavily. "It grieves me to admit, Miss Marple, but Pennington was not loved. Feared, perhaps, respected in certain quarters, but not loved. His death has unsettled the parish, yes, but there are some who almost breathe easier without him." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for a moment, the wool dangling between her fingers. "Yes," she said softly, "and it is among those who breathe easier that we must look most carefully." The vicar nodded, troubled. "Do you think, then, that one of our own?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a kind of sad wisdom. "My dear Reverend, it is so often the case that when evil strikes, it comes not from without, but from within the very circle we least suspect. And so the rivalries, long buried beneath the snow of propriety, rose again in whispered recollections. Pennington's enemies were many, and the feast had provided opportunity enough. What remained now was to discern which of these long-held grudges had finally ripened into murder. It was the following morning, cold and pale with frost, when the postmistress, Mrs. Clegg, bustled into the vicarage with an item that set the whole parish whispering anew. Clutched in her mittened hands was a letter, yellowed at the edges, its seal clumsily broken. "Forgotten, if you can imagine such a thing," she announced, quite out of breath. It was lodged in the back of the pigeonhole. Must have slipped there months ago. Miss Marple, who happened to be taking tea with the vicar, looked up with polite curiosity. A forgotten letter was nothing unusual in village life. Mislaid bills, misaddressed invitations. But the expression on Mrs. Clegg's face suggested something more significant. "It is addressed to Mr. Pennington," the postmistress declared solemnly, "and judging by the handwriting, I should wager it came from a very near relation." She lowered her voice, though there was no one about but the vicar and Miss Marple. "From his nephew in London, Mr. Charles Pennington." The vicar frowned. I had not heard of correspondence between them. Indeed, I was under the impression that relations were somewhat strained. Mrs. Clegg gave a satisfied little nod. "Precisely so, and this letter only confirms it." With the vicar's hesitant permission, the letter was read aloud. Its contents were brief but heavy with bitterness. Charles accused his uncle of withholding funds that had been promised to him, and advanced to assist in establishing a business venture. There were words like betrayal and dishonor, and a thinly veiled threat. "You will not always hold the reins, uncle. One day the balance will tip, and I shall see justice done." Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while the others exchanged uneasy glances. To anyone else, the letter might appear as nothing more than a quarrel over money, but she knew well that money was among the most enduring motives in human affairs. "Do you suppose," Mrs. Clegg whispered, eyes wide, "that young Charles could have come down from London, slipped into the feast unnoticed, and—" She stopped herself with a shudder. The vicar shook his head firmly. "There is no evidence of that. We mustn't leap to conclusions." Still, he gazed at the paper, troubled. "It paints a darker picture of the Pennington household than I had realized." Later that day, Miss Marple walked slowly past the Pennington home. The windows were shuttered in mourning, yet she could not help but wonder what further secrets those walls concealed. A letter forgotten at the post office was one thing, but what of the letters that had been delivered, read, and hidden away? What quarrels had passed in silence between uncle and nephew, unseen by village eyes? At supper with Mrs. Blake that evening, the baker leaned across the table and whispered conspiratorially, "I always thought Mr. Pennington kept his nephew short on purpose. Said the lad was reckless with money. But I dare say there was more spite in it than prudence. Men like Pennington enjoy their power, you see, and nothing pleased him more than making another squirm." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly. She had already guessed as much. Still, it was the particular phrasing of Charles's threat, "The balance will tip," that lingered in her mind. Such words spoke not merely of frustration, but of intent. And so, the forgotten letter, tucked away and nearly lost to dust, breathed new suspicion into the cold winter air. Had Charles indeed returned in secret? Or might another, privy to his grievance, have found in it the very motive to strike? Chapter 5: Snowfall and Deception. The snow had fallen thick through the night, blanketing St. Mildred's in a hush that made the village appear almost innocent again. Yet innocence was far from anyone's mind when Dr. Pembroke, summoned by the coroner, finally gave his testimony in the drawing-room of the Pennington home. Chairs had been arranged in stiff rows, and the villagers, eager for news, sat in tense expectation, their breaths misting faintly in the cold air. Dr. Pembroke was not a man inclined toward drama. He was tall, spare, with a precise manner that came from years of tending both sprains and secrets. Adjusting his spectacles, he began in his dry, deliberate tone. Mr. Pennington's death, he said, was not from natural causes. The evidence is conclusive. The substance detected in his blood was digitalis, administered in a quantity sufficient to prove fatal. A murmur rippled through the listeners. Digitalis, as everyone knew, was a medicine derived from foxglove, used carefully in small doses to regulate the heart. Too much, however, was deadly. Mrs. Blake clasped her hands to her chest. "But surely only a doctor would have access to such a thing," she exclaimed. Dr. Pembroke gave a patient sigh. "Not at all. Digitalis has been prescribed to several in the parish. Indeed, Mr. Harwood keeps a bottle for his heart, and I dare say Lady Frobisher has had recourse to it on occasion. To conclude that only I, or another medical man, could administer it is entirely mistaken." The effect of his words was immediate. Where once suspicion had narrowed toward the maid or the estranged nephew, now it seemed half the parish might be implicated. Everyone knew someone who had a prescription. Everyone recalled a bottle in a drawer or cabinet. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the back, observed the ripple of unease. Dr. Pembroke's testimony had not only widened the circle of suspicion, but also shifted its nature. A murder by knife or blunt instrument suggested passion, a moment's frenzy. But poison was deliberate, thoughtful, cold. The vicar's wife leaned toward Miss Marple and whispered, "Isn't it dreadful? To think that any of us might have had the means. I never trusted medicine bottles lying about, too easily taken up by the wrong hands." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Yes, my dear, though in my experience it is not always the availability of the means that matters most, but the subtlety of the mind that employs them." Meanwhile, Dr. Pembroke pressed on. He described how the fatal dose could have been slipped into a drink, perhaps a glass of mulled wine, or even one of the mince pies glazed with sugar brandy. It would not alter the taste sufficiently for a man like Pennington, hearty in appetite, to notice. Again, a collective shiver ran through the room. The thought that the cheerful feast, with its laughter and toasts, had concealed such malice was almost unbearable. When Dr. Pembroke concluded, silence hung heavy. Then Mr. Harwood, his voice dry with age but sharp with indignation, spoke up. "This is monstrous. To think we all broke bread together that night, and one among us played the murderer. Whoever it was must be unmasked." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Her eyes, gentle yet piercing, moved from face to face, noting the nervous gestures, the lowered gazes, the quickening of breath. The doctor's testimony had not only complicated matters, it had revealed just how very many might have had both motive and means. 2 nights after Dr. Pembroke's testimony, the village was again stirred from its uneasy calm. Snow lay thick along the lanes, muffling the crunch of hurried boots, as word spread that Mrs. Longford had been taken suddenly ill. She had collapsed after tea, clutching at her throat, her face pale as parchment. At first, neighbors thought it the result of shock. Her nerves had never been strong, but when Dr. Pembroke was summoned, his grave expression told another tale. "She has been poisoned," he declared flatly, though in this instance, mercifully, the dose was insufficient to bring death. A faint trace of digitalis, just enough to unsettle the heart, but not to stop it. Someone, it seems, is at their tricks again. The revelation cast a pall over the village. To some, it confirmed that the first death had been no accident. To others, it suggested that the poisoner remained emboldened, perhaps desperate. And most unsettling of all, it indicated the method was more cunning than anyone had realized. Miss Marple visited Mrs. Longford the following afternoon. The poor woman lay propped up with pillows, her lips trembling as she recounted what had happened. "It was the tea," she whispered. "I had only half a cup, poured from the pot that dear Lydia had prepared. It tasted perfectly ordinary. But scarcely 10 minutes later, I felt the most dreadful weakness." Miss Marple sat beside her, smoothing the coverlet with a gentle hand. Her mind, however, was alert. If the tea had been tainted, then the poisoner had acted in a way both brazen and precise. But something struck her as peculiar. "Tell me, Mrs. Longford, did anyone else partake of that pot?" The invalid shook her head faintly. "No, it was poured after the others had left. Just for me. I thought it rather kind." Later, as Miss Marple walked back through the snow, she turned the matter over. The same poison had been used, but the circumstances were quite different. At the feast, Mr. Pennington had eaten heartily from the shared table. The opportunity was wide, the method clumsy, yet fatal. But with Mrs. Longford, the act had been intimate, calculated. Someone had sought to disguise their hand beneath the guise of personal kindness. That evening, a small gathering formed at the vicarage. Reverend Winthrop, anxious to reassure the parish, invited a few trusted villagers to talk openly. But instead of calm, the meeting stirred further alarm. "It proves," said Mr. Harwood, pounding the arm of his chair, "that the poisoner is still among us, and bolder than before. To slip it into tea in a private house. None of us is safe." Lady Frobisher, elegant even in her widow's weeds, lifted her chin. "It is not boldness, Mr. Harwood, but cleverness. The first attempt was a blunt strike, meant to remove Pennington. This second was a test, perhaps, to divert suspicion, or to suggest that the culprit is careless. In either case, it reveals much." Miss Marple, who had been listening quietly, spoke at last. "It reveals, my lady, that the poisoner is not content merely with the means, but with the method itself. Whoever it is, they wish us to believe that the danger lies in what we share together. But in truth, it is in what is singled out, that which is meant for one alone, that we find the hand of guilt." Her words fell softly, yet they unsettled the room more than any raised voice could have done. For in that instant, each person wondered, who among them had been so precise, so deliberate, and so unflinchingly cruel? Chapter 6. Threads in the Tapestry. It was on a clear, brittle morning, the snow glistening like powdered sugar upon the rooftops, that Miss Marple settled by her window with a fresh skein of wool. The gentle click of her knitting needles was steady, but her mind was far from idle. For in her thoughts, she began to weave together the many fragments of the case, threads as tangled as any basket of yarn, yet each possessing its own color and texture. There was the matter of Mr. Pennington himself, a man both admired and despised, whose sharp words had left wounds that lingered. His death at the feast, taken suddenly amidst the merriment, was shocking, but less so when one considered how many had reason to wish him gone. That was one thread. Another lay in the forgotten letter. Charles Pennington's bitter accusations and veiled threats spoke of family discord, of resentment festering across distance and time. Had the nephew returned in secret, determined to balance old grievances? Or had someone closer at hand found the letter and seen in it an opportunity to disguise their own actions? Then came Dr. Pembroke's testimony. The poison was not rare, not difficult to come by. A dozen villagers might plausibly have had access. What mattered was not who could obtain it, but who would dare to use it under the cover of festivity. Poison, Miss Marple reflected, was the weapon of calculation, of someone who preferred quiet certainty to messy confrontation. She paused, glancing down at her knitting, and thought of Mrs. Longford's illness. A second attempt, weaker but revealing. If the first had been reckless in its breadth, the second had been intimate and personal. And it was precisely there, in the contrast between the two, that Miss Marple sensed the truth emerging. The second poisoning was not merely another strike, it was a message. It revealed a hand that wished to experiment, to confirm suspicion, perhaps even to cast blame in a new direction. Yet among all these threads, one small detail tugged most persistently. She recalled the glasses at the feast, set upon the table in neat rows. Several had been exchanged in the jovial bustle. A minor detail, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple had noticed the moment Mr. Pennington's glass was moved aside by Mrs. Blake to make room for another dish. Had the poison been intended specifically for him, or might it have been a matter of chance? The thought lingered unsettling. If chance had played a part, then the murderer's plan was more fragile than supposed. If not, then the care with which Pennington's glass was singled out suggested a mind meticulous indeed. As the church bell tolled the hour, Miss Marple laid her knitting across her lap. She could almost see the tapestry forming in her mind, the rivalries, the resentments, the means and opportunities. Each thread wound toward the center, where the truth lay waiting to be drawn forth. People, she murmured softly to herself, are very much like patterns. At first, all appears muddled, a confusion of colors and shapes. But, given time, one sees the design, the intent behind every stitch. And so it is with murder. Her eyes twinkled, though there was no smile upon her lips. For Miss Marple knew that the picture was nearly complete. A few more threads, carefully pulled, would reveal the figure in full. And when it did, the village of St. Mildred's would never look upon its feast or its friends in quite the same way again. The next afternoon, Miss Marple proposed a small gathering at her cottage. Nothing formal, nothing that might alarm the already nervous villagers. Just a quiet tea, she said. To keep our spirits up, the idea was welcomed with relief. After so many days of whispers and fear, the thought of steaming teapots, currant scones, and the warmth of Miss Marple's sitting room was a balm. The snow outside had softened into slush, but her little fire burned brightly, casting cheerful flickers upon the wallpaper. Around the hearth sat Lady Frobisher, Mrs. Blake, Mr. Harwood, and the vicar's wife. They chattered at first about weather and parish duties, grateful for the comfort of the familiar. Yet beneath it all ran an undercurrent of unease. Everyone knew that murder still lingered among them. Miss Marple moved quietly from guest to guest, pouring tea, offering sandwiches, and listening with her usual attentiveness. Her eyes, however, were sharper than her manner suggested. She was watching for something quite specific, an inconsistency, a gesture, the smallest slip of a mask. At last she set down the teapot and, as if idly, remarked, "I suppose it is curious, is it not, how easily one might mistake one's own cup at such a feast? So many glasses, so many plates shuffled about." Mrs. Blake stiffened slightly, her plump hands busying themselves with a slice of seed cake. Lady Frobisher, ever composed, merely inclined her head. But Mr. Harwood gave a sharp grunt. "Indeed, I said as much to the doctor. One never truly knows whether one's portion is one's own." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "And yet," she continued, "Mr. Pennington's glass was never confused. It was placed just so, and never touched by another. That, I think, is rather telling." The room grew still. Mrs. Blake's eyes darted toward the fire, avoiding every other gaze. Lady Frobisher folded her hands, regal and silent. The vicar's wife, flustered, whispered something about Providence. Miss Marple let the silence deepen. Then she poured a fresh round of tea. "I thought, today we might try something new," she said gently. From a small tin, she produced a jar of sugar brandy, the same kind used to glaze the mince pies at the feast. A festive touch, you see, but I dare say we shall all be careful which cup is ours. The words hung in the air, deceptively mild. Yet each guest glanced toward their teacup with new wariness, as though it might conceal more than milk or lemon. Miss Marple did not linger on the moment. She moved on to chatter about church flowers, the upcoming Epiphany service, and the rising cost of wool. But she had seen what she needed. The flicker of fear in one pair of eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of a hand upon a cup. A signal, faint but certain, that the pattern in her mind was correct. By the time the guest departed, thanking her warmly for the comfort of her table, Miss Marple knew the trap had sprung, not loudly, not with force, but with the quiet precision she favored. The truth was now within reach. All that remained was to reveal it at the proper time, when the last thread could be drawn tight and the tapestry displayed for all to see. And so, as the door closed behind her final guest, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire, her knitting in her lap. Her expression was serene, almost grandmotherly, but in her eyes lay the steady glimmer of certainty. The murderer had shown their hand. Chapter 7. The Final Feast. The village hall had never felt so oppressive. The very room that had resounded with laughter, carols, and the clatter of plates during the Christmas feast now seemed draped in shadows. Chairs were set in rows, and villagers filed in slowly, their boots leaving damp marks upon the wooden floor as the snow outside melted into slush. A hush lingered over them, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the low murmur of nervous voices. Reverend Winthrop had called them together at Miss Marple's suggestion. He stood at the front, attempting to appear calm, but his hands trembled slightly as he smoothed the pages of his prayer book. "My friends," he began, "we gather not for celebration, but for clarity. A terrible deed has darkened our parish, and it is our duty to face it with honesty." The villagers shifted uneasily. Mrs. Blake sat with her apron folded tightly across her lap, her usually rosy cheeks pale. Mr. Harwood scowled at the floor, as though daring anyone to meet his eye. Lady Frobisher, dignified as ever, kept her chin high, though her gloved hands were clasped a little too tightly. At the back of the hall, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting bag at her side. She looked every inch the kindly old lady who had wandered in from the cold, but her eyes moved carefully across the room. She noted the whispers, the stiffness of posture, the darting glances. Fear lay thick in the air, fear of discovery, fear of accusation. It was the memory of the feast that haunted them all. The long tables dressed in holly, the scent of mince pies and spiced wine, the candle flames reflected in polished glasses. To think that beneath such cheerfulness, death had been served. It weighed heavily on every conscience. "I suppose," Mrs. Longford said suddenly, her voice trembling, "that we are gathered to learn who among us is guilty." Her words were met with silence. No one wanted to speak the truth aloud, yet everyone thought it. The murderer was not some stranger from afar. He or she was seated among them, warming by the same fire, sipping from the same teacups, exchanging the same polite greetings. Miss Marple rose slowly, with a quiet dignity that drew every eye. "It is never easy," she said softly, "to accept that wickedness can dwell so near to home. Yet I have always found that human nature is much the same in a village as it is in a city: pettiness, pride, envy, greed. The difference, perhaps, is that in a village we are obliged to face one another each day, and so our little failings are more easily seen." Her voice was gentle, but it carried, filling the hall more surely than the vicar's. The villagers leaned forward, half dreading and half yearning for the revelation they knew must come. Outside, the church bells tolled the hour, their solemn peal drifting through the frosted windows. Inside, the people of St. Mildred sat rigid, waiting. Their breaths came quick, their faces pale in the candlelight. It was, in every sense, a second feast. Not of food, but of secrets. A feast of truth, to which all were summoned and from which none could walk away unchanged. And at its head, as calm and composed as ever, sat Miss Marple, ready at last to lay the tapestry bare. A silence heavier than stones settled across the hall as Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and folded her hands neatly before her. The crackling fire seemed suddenly loud, each snap of the logs marking the gravity of the moment. "You see," she began in that deceptively mild tone of hers, "the answer has been before us all along. We need only to consider carefully what happened on that Christmas night." Every head turned toward her. Mrs. Blake clutched at her apron as though it might protect her. Mr. Harwood shifted, restless, his boot heel tapping nervously against the floor. Even Lady Frobisher, for once, lowered her eyes. At the feast, Miss Marple continued, "The poisoned mince pie was placed before dear Mr. Pennington. We assumed the danger lay in the pies themselves, yet only one was fatal. That suggests not a general misfortune, but a deliberate choice." A murmur swept the room. Miss Marple lifted a hand gently, and the whispers ceased. Many of you remembered clearly who sat where, and who was served what. And yet, small inconsistencies crept into your recollections. Some said Mr. Pennington sat beside Mr. Harwood. Others swore it was Mrs. Blake. But the truth of the matter is quite simple. It was Lady Frobisher who arranged the seating. The dignified lady's head snapped up, her eyes wide with indignation. "Really, Miss Marple—" "Pray forgive me, Lady Frobisher," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "but it was you who placed Mr. Pennington directly in reach of the pie you had so carefully marked. You used a sprig of holly tied in a ribbon, did you not? A decoration you claimed was charming, yet which served as your signal." Gasps filled the room. The vicar's hand trembled so violently that his prayer book slipped to the floor with a thud. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, even sympathetic. "You see, Lady Frobisher bore a grievance. Few knew that your late husband had lost a considerable sum in one of Mr. Pennington's schemes. You were left to keep up appearances, to manage debts quietly, and to watch him prosper while you endured the strain. The letter that surfaced, yes, the forgotten letter, revealed as much." Lady Frobisher's composure faltered. Her gloved fingers twisted at her lap, tugging, wringing, as though seeking escape. It was a clever plan," Miss Marple went on softly. "You waited until the feast, certain that no one would suspect you. You tampered with only one pie, ensuring the rest would appear harmless. And when Mr. Pennington fell, you counted on confusion to shield you. But alas, a second attempt revealed the truth. The very method of poison, slipped into the brandy butter, betrayed the hand that had access to both the kitchen and the table. The villagers stared, eyes wide, breaths held. At last Mrs. Longford whispered, "So it was her." Lady Frobisher rose suddenly, the bench scraping against the floor. Her voice, when it came, was sharp and wounded. "He ruined lives, not only mine, others here as well. He deceived, he stole, he left misery in his wake. Is it such a crime to see justice done when no one else would?" Miss Marple regarded her with infinite sadness. "My dear, justice is not ours to serve in such a manner. To choose death for another is to take upon oneself the darkest of burdens. No matter how grievous the wrong, the taking of life cannot be excused." The hall was utterly still. Outside, the snow fell soundlessly blanketing the village in white. Inside, the truth lay bare, stark as the winter landscape. Lady Frobisher's shoulders sagged. At last, she lowered her gaze, her voice breaking. "Yes, it was I." And with that admission, the spell of silence broke, and the village breathed again, though none would ever forget the moment when the mask of respectability was torn away to reveal the crime beneath. Chapter 8. After the Snowfall. The morning after Lady Frobisher's confession dawned with a hush so complete that it seemed the world itself wished to forget the turmoil of the previous days. Snow had drifted high along the hedgerows and lay in delicate folds upon cottage roofs, softening every line, erasing every trace of human conflict. From the vicarage to the baker's shop, chimneys puffed gentle threads of smoke into the frosty air, carrying with them the comforting sense of toast and tea. It was as though the village had collectively decided that life must go on. Mrs. Blake opened her shop at the usual hour, though she set out fewer loaves than customary, her hands moving a touch more slowly than before. Mr. Harwood swept his step with exaggerated care, pausing now and then to glance down the lane, as if seeking reassurance that neighbors still nodded to him in greeting. Even the children, muffled in scarves and mittens, seemed quieter, their games of snowball and sledding subdued by the memory of what had so recently transpired. Inside parlors, conversation tiptoed around the subject. Mrs. Longford poured her sister a cup of strong tea and declared that she would say no more on the matter, for it was not fit for Christmas week. Yet, scarcely 5 minutes later, she found herself recounting every detail of the feast to the neighbor who dropped by with a basket of eggs. Such is the way of villages. Scandal is best left unspoken, unless it can be shared in whispers over the teapot. The vicar, deeply shaken, devoted his Sunday sermon to forgiveness and the dangers of hidden resentment. His voice wavered only once when he spoke of bearing one another's burdens, and many in the pews cast their eyes down, suddenly thoughtful. A sense of collective guilt seemed to hang in the air, not for the crime itself, but for the years of overlooking small cruelties and grievances that had allowed bitterness to grow unchecked. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly by her fire in St. Mary Mead, a ball of soft pink wool in her lap. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a steady rhythm as she reflected upon events. She was not triumphant, nor did she dwell in sorrow. Rather, she considered, as she so often did, how very ordinary human motives could lead to extraordinary tragedy. To most, Lady Frobisher had been the embodiment of dignity, yet beneath the polished exterior had dwelt years of disappointment, envy, and silent rage. Now, the village had returned to calm, or at least the semblance of it. For calm in a village is like the surface of a pond, smooth and glistening, while beneath, unseen currents stir. But to the casual eye, all appeared serene once more. Candles were placed in windows as dusk approached, casting golden squares upon the snow. Families gathered for supper, grateful for their safety, their warmth, their togetherness. At the Crown and Anchor, Mr. Harwood raised a cautious toast. To peace in St. Mildred's, he declared, though his eyes flickered nervously about the room, as though half expecting another revelation to break the spell. The villagers joined him nevertheless, their glasses clinking softly, their voices subdued but sincere. And so, after the snowfall, St. Mildred's wore once more the face of an English village in winter, calm, picturesque, and reassuring. Yet those who lived there knew that beneath its frosted charm lay memories that would not soon be forgotten. Life had resumed, yes, but it was touched now with a quiet knowledge that even amid holly and hymns, secrets could bloom, and beneath the gentlest snowfall, shadows might still lie. In the quiet days that followed, The village settled once more into its customary rhythm, though an invisible thread of reflection lingered among its people. Snow still draped the hedges and muffled the lanes, but inside, fires burned steadily, lamps glowed warmly, and conversations took on a more thoughtful timbre than before. It was in the vicarage sitting room, with its floral curtains and scent of pine boughs, that Miss Marple found herself gently pressed into recounting her part in the affair. The vicar and his wife had invited a small company, Mr. Harwood, Mrs. Longford, and the schoolmistress, Miss Avery, under the pretense of afternoon tea. In truth, they sought not details of scandal, but reassurance, a reminder that goodness still held sway in their little community. Miss Marple, her knitting in her lap, smiled kindly. "You see," she said, "most people are not wicked by design. They are simply human. We all have our small envies, our hidden grievances, our little secrets. Some bury them deep, others wear them lightly. But if left untended, they may grow like weeds in a garden and choke the better parts of ourselves." Mrs. Longford nodded gravely, stirring her tea with such force that the spoon clattered against china. "I should think," she said, "that many of us might have been tempted had we endured what Lady Frobisher did. Though, of course, murder is murder." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling with a peculiar blend of sorrow and wisdom. "Temptation is universal, but action is a choice. And it is kindness, small, daily kindness, that prevents temptation from hardening into resolve. A kind word to a lonely soul, a courtesy offered when one feels least inclined, such things may alter the course of a life. We cannot always know how much." The vicar's wife, dabbing her eyes, murmured, "How true, Miss Marple. It is the neglect of kindness that breeds despair, more than outright cruelty." Miss Avery, who had been silent until then, spoke with unusual fervor. "And secrecy," she added. "We keep things to ourselves, pride, shame, sorrow, when perhaps they should be shared. It festers, doesn't it?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite so. Secrecy may be born of dignity or of fear. Yet when it shuts others out, it may also shut hope out. Lady Frobisher bore her burden alone, and so it grew heavier than she could bear." The fire snapped, sending a spark upward into the chimney, and for a long moment no one spoke. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily past the window, dissolving against the pane. The hush seemed to underscore Miss Marple's words, pressing them gently but firmly into the minds of her listeners. At last, the vicar cleared his throat. "You give us much to ponder, Miss Marple. Perhaps our task now is to practice greater charity, both in word and in deed, to notice the quiet sufferings of our neighbors, and to lighten them where we can." A murmur of agreement circled the room. Teacups were set down, sighs were breathed, and something in the air softened, as though a weight had been lifted, replaced by a fragile but real resolve. Later, walking home along the snowy lane, Miss Marple paused beneath the holly tree outside the vicarage. Its berries glowed red against the white, a cheerful sight, though it recalled too vividly the feast that had begun in merriment and ended in tragedy. Still, she smiled faintly. After all, she thought, life is both shadow and light. It is our task to cherish the light, however fleeting it may seem. And with that, she pulled her shawl closer, and the sound of her footsteps faded gently into the stillness of the winter night. And so, dear friends, the mystery of the Deadly Mincemeat Feast draws to its close. The truth has been uncovered, justice quietly served, and the little village of St. Mildred's breathes once more in its timeless rhythm. Church bells chiming, teacups clinking, and snow drifting softly past lamplit windows. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, returned to her knitting with a gentle satisfaction, reflecting, as she always did, that beneath the pleasant rituals of village life, human hearts remain complex things, capable of kindness, yet shadowed by envy, pride, or fear. But tonight, peace is restored, and the hearth glows bright once again. Thank you for joining me by the fire for this tale of secrets and snowbound suspense. I wonder, had you been at the feast, what detail might have caught your eye? Do share your thoughts, and until our next story, may warmth and wisdom accompany you.